I thank my colleagues for joining us, and I look forward to hearing their perspectives on the issues facing the Department of Homeland Security's mission to protect our nation. I would now like to turn to the distinguished gentleman from Tennessee, Ranking Member Fleischman, for his opening remarks.
Thank you, Madam Chairman, and to all of the members. You will find that Chairman Robel Allard and I have worked famously well together on this subcommittee that deals with some very contentious issues, but very important issues that affect our nation. And we are very solicitous of all the members' requests and thoughts as we go through the appropriation process, and we thank each and every one of you all for being here today. Thank you, and Madam Chair, I yield back.
Thank you so much, Chairwoman and Ranking Member, for the opportunity to present my views for the fiscal year 2021 Homeland Security Appropriations Bill. My views will be related primarily to the Virgin Islands, although I know you all have so many issues in areas that you stand ready to support. 2.5 years after Hurricanes Irma and Maria, the progress of recovery in the U.S. Virgin Islands and Puerto Rico has been slow, and the islands remain vulnerable. The Transportation Infrastructure Committee, which, as you know, has the authorizing jurisdiction over federal emergency management, led a congressional delegation down to the islands last week, where they were briefed by FEMA and toured some of the critical projects. One of the most pressing and outstanding issues is the slow pace of recovery and the great disparity between what has been promised and what can be spent on recovery. In all of the after-action reports, this is a constant theme. Less than 50% of public assistance projects in the Virgin Islands have been obligated as of our visit last week, and the vast majority of the obligations have been for emergency work projects, not for rebuilding. As of last month, approximately 35% of what has been obligated has been for permanent infrastructure projects, and less than 20% of what the territory has been able to draw down has been from permanent work. Some of the challenges we face in the recovery are exacerbated by federal policies which are within the power of Congress to change. Most concerning to me is that FEMA continues to refuse its exercise its statutory discretion. Under the Insular Areas Act, they have the ability to waive the local match for permanent categories of public assistance in response to Hurricanes Irma and Maria, requiring that Virgin Islands come up with hundreds of millions of dollars in a budget that already has a shortfall that are still being supplied by a federal mandate under the Community Development Block Grant Disaster Recovery Program. FEMA public assistance on its own is estimated to cost about $5 billion in the territory, and with a 10% match of totaling approximately $500 million, that means that over 25% of the money it is being granted has being used in order to make the 10% match. If the 10% cost share is waived, the islands could instead redirect those funds to protect the federal investments in reconstructed critical infrastructure to lessen the need for taxpayer-funded disaster assistance in the future. This waiver has been utilized in the past in Katrina, Maria, in Maryland, as well as in Hugo in the past. And because we also have a federal disaster monitor, we can be assured that the money is going to be used appropriately since we have manual drawdowns that are being done. Therefore, there's not a concern that the money with the waiver of the 10% match would be used indiscriminately. I therefore urge a legislative directive for FEMA to exercise the waiver authority it has under the Insular Areas Act on public assistance grants for emergency and permanent work in the Virgin Islands. CBO has informed the Transportation Infrastructure Committee that such a directive would, quote, would not increase net direct spending over the 2020-2029 period. In addition, while the Public Assistance Alternative Procedures Program can provide funding for projects up front based upon fixed cost estimates, the development of fixed estimates that accurately forecast the future costs of completing large, complex, permanent projects in the Virgin Islands has been very difficult, given unique circumstances that influence construction costs in the territory. such as limited availability of local resources and the need to import construction materials and labor. Meanwhile, FEMA has imposed a deadline of March 20th to finalize all fixed cost estimates for all such projects. That's a month away. As of last month, only 5 fixed cost estimates had been finalized out of hundreds of projects. Given the challenges implementing the Public Assistance Alternative Funding Program has delayed recovery in the Virgin Islands, I respectfully request that the subcommittee extend the arbitrarily fixed cost estimates deadline by at least 6 months to September 20th, 2020. There are other areas that we are interested in as well. We'd like to request a visa waiver program that has been allowed in other insular areas, such as Northern Marianas and American Samoa. We are all outside of the customs zone. This would allow us to compete with other Caribbean islands for tourism, greater opportunities for international events, and support our small businesses and medical facilities to allow individuals from other Caribbean islands to come into the Virgin Islands on an expedited visa process. This would not allow them to come into the United States. It keeps them only within the Virgin Islands. There are also issues related to customs and security issues, increased support for Customs and Border Protection and Coast Guard, since we are on the front lines of drug trafficking in the Caribbean. This is an overwhelming cost that will need to be supported, and this would be a real preventative factor to drugs and guns coming into the United States. I've run out of time, and so I'll submit my written testimony with the details on many of these issues. Thank you so much.
Thank you, ma'am.
Madam Chairman, thank you, Ranking Member, members of the committee. My name is Russ Fulcher from the great state of Idaho, and the comments I have today are in regard to southern border security. I come before you today to support the American people who have been devastated by drug and human trafficking across our southern border. According to the Congressional Research Service, an estimated 65% of illicit drugs seized in America between 2014 and 2018 were seized at our southern border. Marijuana, cocaine, heroin, methamphetamine, opioids with fentanyl. In 2019 alone, Border Patrol agents seized enough fentanyl to give every American a lethal overdose. And with the exception of marijuana, there were more seizures of every other drug in 2019 than the previous 5 years combined. Last week, and the main reason I'm here this week, I and several other members toured the Arizona border area. We met with private landowners and local, federal, and tribal law enforcement. It's obvious that traffickers, sometimes called mules or coyotes, find weaknesses in border security regions, and they exploit them. And in so doing, they trigger an increase in crime, human trafficking, expensive U.S. taxpayer dollars, and yes, death, a lot of it. Although the motivations for people wishing to cross into the U.S. could be complicated, a large part of the solution is not. We need to build a wall. Is it the sole solution? No, but it's a darn good start. Where we already have it in place, it's a game changer. For some reason, for the same reason we lock our doors at night, have security systems, or perhaps a fence around our homes, it's imperative that we take similar precautions for the Americans we're responsible for protecting. Portions of the regions toured have a wall. Others do not. Not surprisingly, the traffic skews heavily to the regions where there are poor or no barriers. Spent water bottles, carpet shoe coverings, and empty backpacks provide evidence where the illicit activities occur. Before last week, I relied on others to inform me as to what is happening on our border. But last week I saw it myself, and virtually every stakeholder that I spoke with, living or working in the border region, told me the same thing. The late 1990s, everything changed. Illicit cartels grew into prominence, so much so that today they often manage the Mexican side of the border. They're there to make money, and they don't care how they do it or who gets hurt in the process. I used to think they traffic just drugs, but I learned it's much more than that. For example, cartel personnel will intercept migrants heading to our border and extort them, promising safe passage into America, often lying to them, telling them their desired destination, such as New York or maybe Kansas City, is just over that ridge. They kidnap women and girls, sell them into the sex trade. Older people and children are used repeatedly, often as decoys to distract authorities away from the cartel activities. As far as I'm concerned, these people are the scum of the earth, and we have a responsibility to protect our citizens and those preyed upon. But local, federal, and tribal law enforcement all agree that these cartels are armed and financed comparably to the Mexican military forces, and their tactics of extortion and bribery have created an environment where it's difficult to know who one can trust. Native American families are often confronted by cartel scouts and given an ultimatum: either help get their contraband, whether human or otherwise, into the U.S. and get paid for it, or face losing a spouse, children, or even their own lives. Mexican and American law enforcement personnel face threats such as, don't show up for your next work shift or you'll never see your daughter again. I encourage you to do what I did. Please go take a look for yourself. I believe an objective person will come to the same conclusions I have. Physical border security is functionally or foundationally critical and in the best long-term interest of everyone. Please keep in mind, the nefarious actors triggering so much suffering don't give a rip about American people or what party controls the United States Congress. They just want to make money, and they don't care who they hurt in order to do it. Now, the elephant in the room, pun accepted, is the notion that congressional Republicans don't have enough compassion for immigrants, and that Democrats want high immigration numbers because that eventually tends to translate into more Democrat votes. What you believe is up to you, but as members of Congress, my request to you today is to put all that aside and just look at the facts. Porous borders come with a very high cost, be it in fiscal terms, breach security, or terms of human suffering. A border wall gives us a fighting chance to simply insert some control into the situation. And without some degree of control, policies really don't matter that much. Please join me in supporting the American people, current and future, with the appropriation necessary for a border wall. And I'll close with this. I offer thanks to the law enforcement officials and the ranch families that met with us. Sheriff Mark Lamb and the many border and police agents, you're heroes. Thank you, Madam Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Fulton.
Thank you, Congressman.
Ms. Gonzalez-Colon.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair and members of the committee for having me again here this year. Today, I would like to focus on the need to ensure the Department of Homeland Security has the necessary resources and assets to enhance border security operations in Puerto Rico and the U.S. Virgin Islands, our nation's Caribbean border. As well, coordinated approach to secure U.S. homeland requires attention to the Caribbean. Puerto Rico and the U.S. Virgin Islands have long been exploited by criminal organizations as a destination and transit zone for illegal drugs, which endangers the lives of Americans in the two territories and in the mainland. We are at the forefront of our nation's efforts to combat transnational criminal organizations, and Congress should respond accordingly. The U.S. Coast Guard fiscal year 2021 budget request includes two funding increases that will support this approach. The first one will be the Coast Guard is requesting an increase of $29.9 million to Transition Air Station Borinquen in Aguadilla, which is in the western part of the island, just 186 miles from Dominican Republic, from MH-65 to MH-60 helicopters. I strongly support this request, and the reason for that is that the new helicopters will improve border security mission effectiveness and search and rescue missions due to their greater capacity for people and equipment and their longer on-scene time. This is especially important in Air Station Borinquen area of responsibility where the large swaths of ocean between islands limit options of refueling. With increased range, these new helicopters will be able to reach and patrol international waterways and threat vectors that are currently unreachable by MH-65s. Transitioning Air Station Borinquen will be crucial to enhance Coast Guard capabilities in Puerto Rico. providing much-needed resources to combat criminal organizations that are exploiting the Caribbean. The fiscal year 2021 budget request includes a $2.5 million increase to expand Coast Guard capacity to execute a multi-layer approach in the Western Hemisphere maritime transit zone. This funding will increase the Coast Guard capacity to counter transnational criminal organizations in Puerto Rico and the U.S. Virgin Islands, and therefore, I request that the subcommittee similarly provide this increase for fiscal year 2021. ICE and Homeland Security investigations also plays a crucial role in securing our Caribbean border. The agency is requesting $400,000 to support operations and maintenance of prior completed tactical communications site expansions in Puerto Rico and the U.S. Virgin Islands. These tactical communication systems facilitate radio communication among federal partners, public safety agencies, state and local and territorial stakeholders. The requested $400,000 will support the new infrastructure that will minimize redundancies and communication gaps that exist between DHS components and other federal, state, and local partners. Given how this will strengthen our security capabilities in the region, I respectfully request your support and include this funding increase. I would also like to request a robust funding for U.S. Customs and Border Protection, Air and Maritime Operations, CBP, which support the operations and assets of the Caribbean Air and Marine Branch for U.S. Border Patrol, which support the operations of the RAMI Border Patrol Sector in Puerto Rico, which is the only CBP office outside the U.S. continental mainland. Additionally, I'm requesting that the subcommittee maintain bill language allowing CBP to sustain or increase operations in Puerto Rico with appropriated funds, a provision that has been included in every enacted appropriations bill since 2015. I also urge this committee to provide robust funding for state homeland security grants, Operation Stone Garden grants, port security grants, and emergency management performance grants, which provide critical resources to local law enforcement agencies in Puerto Rico. Finally, I would like to request this committee to provide $1.7 million increase requested by FEMA in its fiscal year 2021 budget request to renovate its distribution center in Puerto Rico. This funding will support the renovation and installation of new racking, increasing capacity in the distribution center by 33%, and enhancing FEMA's ability to provide life-saving commodities and supplies in the event of a future disaster in the Caribbean. I think we got experience in the last 2 years about this, and I want to thank almost all members of this committee have been to Puerto Rico in the last 2 to 3 years. So thank you for the support for the islands.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman, and the ranking member, and the other members of the committee. I appreciate taking all the time to listen to everybody about their different requests that they have. I'm here today joining a bipartisan effort to ask you to increase the funding for the Urban Area Security Initiative Nonprofit Security Grant Program for fiscal year 2020. We're trying to get it up to $240 million. This important program provides funding for nonprofit organizations around the country which are at high risk of terrorist attack. Today, this program is particularly critical so that we can help protect our houses of worship. Across America, we're facing record levels of hate and intolerance. While overall crime continues to decline, hate crimes continue to increase. In my home state of New York, we've recently witnessed horrific and hateful attacks, particularly against the Jewish community. In Muncie, New York, an intruder stabbed 5 people as they were gathering to light candles for Hanukkah. In my own hometown of Glen Cove, New York, anti-Semitic graffiti was sprayed not once but twice at the Holocaust Memorial and Tolerance Center of Nassau County. Why is this happening? I believe divisive rhetoric at the highest levels in our nation, the misuse of social media, and ignorance are major contributors. In addition, I believe that our foreign adversaries are using social media to foment hate and civil unrest across our country. I recently sent a bipartisan letter with my New York colleagues to the head of the CIA, the FBI, Homeland Security, and the Department of Justice, calling for an investigation
detection of the misuse of social media by our foreign adversaries to incite anti-Semitism and civil unrest. We need to do everything we can to protect our local communities and show perpetrators of hate that an attack against one community is an attack against us all. Last month, we commemorated the 75th anniversary of the liberation of the German Nazi concentration and extermination camp Auschwitz and the murder of 6 million Jews and millions of others as part of the most brutal genocide in our history. Here in the House, we recently passed the Never Again Education Act, which gives teachers across the United States the resources necessary to teach our children the invaluable lessons of the Holocaust and the horrific consequences of intolerance. Oh, golly. You want to start all over again? I was born on August 31st. No. Educating our future generations and combating nefarious use of social media by our foreign adversaries will help in the long term. But in the short term, we must provide immediate protection for our faith-based communities by continuing to support local efforts to enforce our laws and efforts to increase federal funding for law enforcement and security at our synagogues, churches, mosques, and other houses of worship. That's why I'm here today to respectfully ask this committee to increase the funding for the UASI NSGP. Sadly, this program is needed now more than ever. As a nation, diversity has always been our strength. We must embrace our diversity and come together to make our communities safe for those who live, look, love, or worship differently. Thank you very much for your time.
If I may, Madam Chair, I just want to thank the Congressman for all you've done. You represent the area actually that I grew up in and always have an affinity for the Mets, but do really want to thank you for your combating anti-Semitism. It's growing worldwide, it's in this country, and I just want to thank you for your comments today, sir.
Thank you very much, Chuck. I appreciate it. Thank you very much to all of you. Have a great day. I'm sure you're going to have a lot of fun, meet with a lot of people today.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Chairwoman Roybal Allard and Ranking Member Fleischman and Congressman Cuellar for the opportunity to testify. I'll summarize my request today since my time is limited, but respectfully ask that you consider my written testimony when crafting the fiscal year 2021 Homeland Security Bill. It covers a range of issues important to border communities like El Paso, Texas, from staffing and port of entry improvements to the elimination of harmful policies that erode due process. Regarding staffing and port of entry improvements, I urge the committee to consider prohibiting port hardening measures, including the use of concertina wire. My constituents, including business and trade leaders, have shared their opposition with me regarding these unsightly and dangerous barriers that impede trade and travel. I also urge the committee to further modernize CBP by having an outside entity audit both the OFO staffing model and Border Patrol processing regulations and standards. These outside reviews will help our ports run as efficiently as possible and ensure the Border Patrol of today represents the current challenges we face. Next, it is important that the committee defund anti-immigrant measures that are wreaking havoc on our asylum and immigration system and literally creating the humanitarian crises we've been shocked by. Such policies erode due process and place vulnerable migrants in danger. Back in 2017, family separation was piloted in the El Paso sector. Today, Remain in Mexico, prompt asylum claim review, humanitarian asylum review process, and safe third country agreements, all misnomers for what is actually occurring. These agreements have been added to the menu of dangerous policies. I strongly urge the committee to defund all these measures to limit our government's ability to follow our laws and ensure asylum seekers maintain their access to due process in the United States. It is also important to ensure that migrants maintain their rights and safety while detained. One recommendation that is consistent from advocates in El Paso is the need for attorney access to clients in CBP and ICE facilities. The committee should direct DHS to create private spaces at each facility where detainees can either meet in person with an attorney or connect with them telephonically. A dedicated private area for these meetings will guarantee that detainees can fully exercise their right to counsel. Further, I urge the committee to help end prolonged detention in both CBP and ICE custody. Two things can help speed up releases: concurrent processing and employing alternatives to detention. Last year, I urged the committee to include report language to encourage concurrent processing, which is having CBP allow non-governmental organizations to work inside processing centers so migrants could immediately connect with their sponsors after release. I'm asking for that again this year. And the committee should fund evidence-based alternatives to detention like the Family Case Management Program, where out of the families enrolled, over 90% attended their immigration hearings and ICE appointments. A departure from alternatives to detention has been the root cause of inhumane overcrowding in CBP processing centers. It is also important that detainees and agents have an opportunity to make meaningful complaints when they are wronged or witnesses to wrongdoing. I thank the committee for establishing and funding an immigration detention ombudsman in the fiscal year 20 minibus package that is modeled after a provision in one of my bills, the Homeland Security Improvement Act. While this is a welcome development, recent reports indicate that the Trump administration recently appointed a former hate group leader to set up that office. I urge the committee to clarify the intent of this position by making reasonable qualifications for the job a requirement. Without it, I fear that the administration will undercut the ombudsman's credibility and purpose. Congress's intent should be made clear. The Immigration Detention Ombudsman is intended to help resolve misconduct at DHS. Additionally, since my time in office, I've seen an increase in detainee deaths in both ICE and CBP custody. In order to ensure this never happens again, it's important that the committee direct the DHS OIG to hire more investigators who can best analyze what went wrong in these tragic situations and identify gaps in processes. For example, in the deaths of the children that occurred in and around El Paso, the OIG only looked for misconduct or malfeasance by DHS personnel. This was a missed opportunity to provide critical feedback for Congress on DHS operations and policy. Finally, I urge the committee to allow localities and NGOs the ability to be reimbursed for the humanitarian relief services they provide to migrants. Out of the $30 million included in the border supplemental, El Paso has received over $600,000 in reimbursements. However, organizations like the El Pasoans Fighting Hunger Food Bank are still in the process of recouping costs. Given that the second round of reimbursements is underway, I request that the committee consider funding a third round if the need still exists. Border communities on the front lines of the humanitarian crises fueled by this administration should be made whole for the services they provided to help care for migrants. Thank you again for the opportunity to testify before you today and for your consideration.
Thank you, Congressman. And Mr. Swazi, you have Homeland reform?
Yes, it's the same thing again, didn't record before. So, thank you, Madam Chairwoman. It's so good to see you again, and Mr. Ranking Member and all the committee members. I'm here today to join a bipartisan effort to ask you to increase funding for the Urban Area Security Initiative Nonprofit Security Grant Program for fiscal year 2020. This important program provides funding for nonprofit organizations around the country which are at high risk. Today, this program is particularly critical so we can help protect our houses of worship across America. We are facing record levels of hate and intolerance in our country. While overall crime continues to decline in communities such as mine, hate crimes continue to rise. In my home state of New York, we've recently witnessed horrific and hateful attacks, particularly against the Jewish community. In Muncie, New York, an intruder stabbed 5 people as they were gathering to light the candles for Hanukkah. In my own hometown of Glen Cove, New York, anti-Semitic graffiti was found sprayed not once but twice at the Holocaust Memorial and Tolerance Center in Nassau County. Why is this happening? I believe that divisive rhetoric at the very top levels of our nation are contributing to it, as well as the misuse of social media and ignorance are all major contributors. In addition, I believe that our foreign adversaries are using social media to foment hate and civil unrest across our nation. I recently sent a bipartisan letter with my New York colleagues to the head of the CIA, the FBI, Homeland Security, and the Department of Justice, calling for an investigation of the misuse of social media by our foreign adversaries to incite anti-Semitism and civil unrest. We need to do everything we can to protect our communities and show perpetrators of hate that an attack against one community is an attack against all. Last month, we commemorated the 75th anniversary of the liberation of the German Nazi concentration camps at Auschwitz and the murder of about 6 million Jews and millions of others as part of the most hateful genocide in history. Here in the House, we recently passed the Never Again Education Act, which gives teachers across America the resources necessary to teach our children the invaluable lessons of the Holocaust and the horrific consequences of intolerance. Educating our future generations and combating nefarious use of social media by our foreign adversaries will certainly help in the long term. However, in the short term, we must provide immediate protection for our faith-based communities by continuing to support local efforts to enforce our laws and efforts to increase federal funding for law enforcement and security at our synagogues, churches, mosques, and other houses of worship. That's why I'm here today, again, to respectfully request that this committee increase funding for the UASI NSGP. Sadly, this program is needed now more than ever. As a nation, diversity has always been our strength. We must embrace our diversity and come together to make our community safe for those who live, look, love, or worship differently. Thank you very much for your time. Thank you. Really appreciate it. Thank you.
The comments of the ranking member recorded? Because I think they were important and well-founded. They were, okay.
Thank you so much.
Mr. Graves.
How you doing? I don't know about you all, but I thought it was better the second time. Madam Chair, Ranking Member, thank you very much for opening up the committee to testimony from members. I appreciate the opportunity to be here this afternoon. I wanted to bring up 3 issues with you. Number one, in the Coast Guard's budget for the Fast Response Cutter, which is a Coast Guard vessel, an important part of their acquisition program. They're currently funded at 54 hulls. The program is intended to be funded at a total of 58. These vessels have come through with nearly no discrepancies in the last, I believe, dozen vessels. The Coast Guard has credited just in FY18 with 20 lives being saved, over 14,000 pounds of cocaine being seized, and many, many other really important missions of the Coast Guard. The Commandant of the Coast Guard has called it the mainstay of their coastal patrol fleet, and obviously a very important vessel. It is baffling to me that the Coast Guard would come in and not fund those last 4 vessels. You're well aware of what happens when you have a program that's running. You shut it down for even 1 year. You lose your workforce. You lose the consistency. And it does not make sense for taxpayers, does not make sense for the Coast Guard. And I think adding insult to injury to this decision is the fact that the Coast Guard unilaterally made a decision on the offshore patrol cutter to, in fact, increase the cost to that program to taxpayers to the tune of possibly as much as $621 million, unilaterally, using an authority dating back to the 84th Congress that I've never known to be used for a DHS or Coast Guard program in history. Very, very concerning. I don't know what kind of games they're playing or if they're intending to dump it in our lap in the Congress, as is done in some cases, to come plus this back up. But I'll say it again, I don't think it's in the best interest of taxpayers. I don't think it's in the best interest of the Coast Guard. And of course, Madam Chair, with full disclosure, yes, I represent those employees, many of them. But this program, I ask you, look at it yourself. This is a very well-regarded program that has delivered many wins for the U.S. Coast Guard. Secondly, H-2B visas. As you know, the Appropriations Bill has annually included a cap on the H-2B visa program. I am not a fan, and I would never support supplanting U.S. workers with foreign workers. H-2B is designed to be an unskilled worker program. I have landscaping companies, crawfish peelers, sugarcane mill operators, the mill, not the actual field side, that come to us constantly asking us to make these visas available. Studies have been done indicating that one H-2B visa supports nearly 5 U.S. jobs. Here's the scenario. I'll say this 100 times. I would never support a program that would allow for a U.S. worker to be supplanted with a foreign worker by allowing for lower wages to be paid or anything else. In this case, they simply cannot find the workers to peel the crawfish. It's really baffling to me too. I know, I see the surprise on your face, but they can't find the workers to do it. They can't find the workers to go participate in these landscaping companies and jobs and also sugarcane mills. And so what's happened is that our companies have literally had to lay off American workers because they don't have the workers to come in and do these other lowered skilled jobs. I have made it clear to all of them, they must advertise, they must document very clearly that they cannot find the domestic workers to do these jobs before we would do anything to participate in allowing for the H-2B cap to be raised. But the number that has been released in previous years has been woefully insufficient, as I recall, as many as 3 times the applications have been submitted to the federal government than the cap that has actually been released, the visas that have been released. I would be happy to work with you on any type of fraud and abuse type scenarios whereby you find these employer mills and others that are trying to scrupulously bring in foreign workers to circumvent the protections we have in place for the domestic workforce. But I do think it's really important that this committee continue to step up and try and provide more pressure to the administration to release the visas that are needed to protect American jobs, American workforce, and America's small businesses. Lastly, the Disaster Recovery Reform Act of 2018, the President signed into law in October of that year, had a number of really important reforms in FEMA. And I know that all of us here have heard the nightmare stories about disaster victims not getting appropriate assistance. And of course, in your home state, devastating impacts in 2017 hurricanes, but really all across the United States, we've had all sorts of incredible disasters, and in Louisiana as well. One provision that's been incredibly frustrating to us has been one related to it's Section 1209 of that law that requires that the Federal Highway Administration and FEMA get together to develop the appropriate design criteria for evacuation corridors. We had I-12, the interstate, main east-west interstate in this region, that was the barrier separating the east and west lanes, held back over 6 feet of water. And so the interstate was impassable. It caused thousands of people to become victims because they couldn't get off the interstate. They were stranded on the interstate. We had to airdrop food, water, and other things to them. And the FEMA has done a poor job implementing this. There's also a Section 1228 that has to do with inundated and submerged roads. And I just want to urge the committee to include language that would direct the report language to direct the Federal Highway Administration and FEMA to get together to properly provide guidance to FEMA and to the states in terms of the interpretation of the provision. Amen.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I agree on the H-2 visas. Yeah, we've added language, but the administration needs to work with this. So Andy Harris, Shelley Pingree, Dutch, myself, some have lobsters. Some of us have carnival workers that, same like you. So we're working on that. So I would encourage you to work with all 4 of us so we can come up with a solution.
Absolutely.
But we put the language, but the administration.
Well, maybe we need to tighten up the language.
It's given us half, so we need to figure out how we can make it work.
And maybe we could tighten the language. Also, I know some of the disaster workers in your home state ended up using some of those visas as well.
Yes, sir.
So,
Thank you so much.
all right,
Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you.
I think it was on. Is it on now? Yes. Hello, Chairwoman Roybal Allard, Ranking Member Fleischman, and distinguished members. Thank you for the opportunity to speak with you today on my district's appropriations, Homeland Security priorities for fiscal year 2011. I'm grateful for the subcommittee's work last year. You secured funding for issues important to my district, like border security technology, construction improvements at FLETC, Artesia, increased CBP officers, and the hiring of the first class of Border Patrol processing coordinators. As we looked ahead to fiscal year 2021, I would like to discuss 4 areas within CBP that are integral to an efficient and safe border security system and therefore merit your attention. 1, a recruitment and retention strategy to improve hiring at CBP. the hiring of Border Patrol processing coordinators, increased investments at our ports of entry, and increased scanning of vehicles entering the country with non-intrusive inspection technology. As you may know, CBP has a large footprint in my district. We have 3 ports of entry and 6 Border Patrol stations, which employ dozens of hardworking CBP New Mexicans. However, as a native of southern New Mexico, I know full well the challenges that CBP faces in attracting and retaining qualified personnel, particularly in remote areas where an employee's spouse may have trouble finding a job and children must travel far to attend school. Further, being a CBP officer or Border Patrol agent is a demanding job that requires an extraordinary amount of dedication and character to do it well. Therefore, it is essential that CBP has the necessary resources to recruit and retain its personnel, which includes financial and work mobility incentives, as well as a strategy and implementation plan focused on improving the hiring and retention of individuals, particularly in rural and remote areas. One way to efficiently and better staff Border Patrol is through the hiring of processing coordinators. Unfortunately, last year, our broken border security and immigration systems was pushed far beyond its limits, leaving many Border Patrol agents to take on work that they weren't trained to carry out. Processing coordinators receive tailored training to conduct non-law enforcement duties, such as processing and transporting individuals in custody, which improves detention oversight and humanitarian care, and allows traditional agents to return to the field to focus on law enforcement duties at the border. Last year, you included funding for the first class of processing coordinators, and I urge you to continue funding this position in fiscal year 2021 to ensure our Border Patrol agents can remain in the field securing the border. Just as important as ensuring Border Patrol has the necessary resources to be successful is making sure the Office of Field Operations and its ports of entry are properly funded. Last year in my district, the Santa Teresa Port of Entry experienced a 17.4% increase in total trade, totaling $30.5 billion in exported and imported goods. This increase rocketed the port to 4th in total trade for all land ports of entry on the U.S.-Mexico border and 6th in total for all land ports of entry in the country. Santa Teresa's growth is especially remarkable given that it was and continues to be understaffed. According to CBP El Paso Field Operations Leadership, the OFO workload staffing model projects the total number of officers at the port should be considerably higher than its current levels. Furthermore, outdated infrastructure at Santa Teresa is holding back the port from realizing its full potential. At a recent House Homeland Security Subcommittee hearing at the Santa Teresa Port of Entry, the subcommittee learned from CBP and local stakeholders that although the port is growing, it is hampered by infrastructure constraints, which impede expansion of traffic. For ports of entry across the country like Santa Teresa to continue their growth and adapt to the likely increased commerce created by USMCA, it is essential that you allocate funding for port modernization efforts and for increased OFO staffing. Finally, technology needs at our port of entry should be at the forefront of our priorities for CBP as transnational criminal organizations continue to smuggle lethal drugs like heroin, methamphetamine, and fentanyl, the primary driver of the opioid crisis, through our land ports of entry. Alarmingly, only 15% of commercial vehicles and less than 2% of passenger vehicles that enter the United States through land ports of entry are scanned with non-intrusive inspection systems to detect contraband. Last year, I introduced legislation that passed the House of Representatives aiming to increase the rate of NII scanning of vehicles entering the United States to 100%. Members of the subcommittee, I thank you for the opportunity to come before you today, and thank you for your daily dedication to protecting our homeland security. Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, all right, sure. Good to see you. You all right? Yeah. Hey, good afternoon. Welcome. Thank you so much, Mr. Chair. Ranking Member Fleshman, thank you so much for having and distinguished members of the subcommittee. If there are any, okay, there you go, Mr. Rutherford. Good to see you. Appreciate your invitation to appear before the subcommittee today. It's an honor to be here in person to advocate for my district's priorities this year in the Homeland Security Appropriations Bill. Last week, they had the State of the Coast Guard in Charleston, South Carolina, with Admiral Carl Schwartz in the Low Country, and in his remarks, he announced that the service will be substantially increasing its presence in the Charleston area, potentially growing into the largest concentration of Coast Guard assets and personnel in the entire country. The brave men and women of the Coast Guard have the courage and conviction to live a life of service, and I'm excited to have the opportunity to welcome more of them to their new homes in the Low Country in the coming years. And as a representative in Congress, I'm responsible for ensuring that they have the resources they need to do their job, a responsibility that I do not take lightly. One of my very first official visits as a United States Congressman was to a local Coast Guard station in Charleston in the midst of the longest government shutdown in American history. And these heroic young Americans hadn't been paid in weeks, and they were struggling to make ends meet. And I had to look them in the eye and promise them I would do everything that I could to end the shutdown and get them back pay as soon as possible. Their government let them down, put candidly. Ensuring all of our service members are paid on time is one of our most basic responsibilities as their representatives. Anything less is irreconcilable with our oaths to support and defend the Constitution and is an insult to our men and women in uniform. We must also make sure that Coast Guard service members and their families have access to the benefits and support equal to those available to their counterparts in the other military services. Last year, we took an important step in the right direction in the FY20 NDAA, which contained my amendment expanding access to the DoD's My Career Advancement Accounts Scholarship Program if the Coast Guard reimburses DoD. The My CAA program assists military spouses to pursue licenses, certifications, or associate degrees to start a new career. And this program is critical because not only does it improve employment outcomes for participating spouses, it also serves as an important tool to boost recruitment and retention. A 2018 study conducted by RAND found that service members who used the program were up to 8% more likely to stay in the military. So to ensure Coast Guard spouses and the Coast Guard as a whole are able to benefit from this vital program, I'd ask that the committee provide the service with the funding necessary to participate. This year's NDAA also included my amendment authorizing the Coast Guard to establish and maintain their own Junior Reserve Officer Training Corps program. And as you know, prior to the enactment of the FY20 NDAA, the United States Coast Guard did not have the authority to create the new JROTC programs without an explicit authorization by law, depriving students across the country of the opportunity to learn valuable life skills. An expanded Coast Guard JROTC program will serve as a valuable recruiting tool and instill the service's core values of honor, respect, and devotion to duty in thousands of our nation's young men and women, regardless of their plans after graduation. Accordingly, I urge the committee to ensure they have the resources and the funding necessary to implement this program. I also want to offer my support for funding included in the President's budget towards personnel increases and infrastructure improvements at Base Charleston's to homeport a 5th national security cutter. The Low Country is slated to become a center of gravity in the Coast Guard's Homeland Security and National Defense missions, so it's imperative that we provide them the funding they need to renovate and enhance existing facilities to expedite their planned expansions in Charleston. And finally, I want to thank each and every one of you all for your important work as members of this subcommittee. I'm looking forward to working with you to ensure our Homeland Security agencies have the resources that they need in order to keep us safe. Thank you again for your time.
Thank you, Mr. Cunningham. Members, any questions?
Mr. Chairman, I just have a comment. I want to thank Congressman Cunningham for his thoughtful support of the Coast Guard. I've had a very similar experience. These are outstanding men and women from the Commandant all the way down into the enlisted ranks. We have visited Coast Guard bases all across the country. And I also share your sentiments that these men and women did suffer through some very difficult times during that very difficult government shutdown. Fortunately, that issue was finally resolved, but let's hope that it never happens again. And again, I thank you for your advocacy because they are a great fighting force, they're a great law enforcement force, and wherever they are, they do a great job. So I thank you, sir.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Thank you all so much.
Thank you so much.
Appreciate it. Appreciate it.
All right, since I see no other members here,
They're not scheduled until 3:55.
oh, through 3:50, oh,
Yeah,
okay. At ease, members. Sure, we're ready to proceed with you. Committee, and if you want to proceed with your testimony, thank you so much.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you, Congressman Requer and members of the Appropriations Committee on Homeland Security and Congressmember Fleischman. Thank you for holding this Member Day hearing today. I appreciate the opportunity to voice support for several policies, including opposition to the public charge rule, reversing the administration's hateful Muslim ban, and reuniting families through clearing immigration visa backlogs. On Monday, February 24th, the Trump administration's discriminatory public charge rule went into effect. By changing the definition of public charge, this rule acts as a wealth test for legal immigrants and makes it more difficult for them to get green cards or adjust their status if they have used or are likely to use benefits such as Medicaid, housing assistance, the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, and other programs. I'm the author of the No Federal Funds for Public Charge Act. It's H.R. 3222, which would block any funding from being used to implement this discriminatory public charge. Immigrants who use public benefits that they've paid into through taxes should not be penalized for that when they apply for green cards or other adjustment of immigration status. Already, we're seeing a decrease in healthcare enrollment and communities fearful of using benefits that they are eligible for in case it might affect their immigration status or that of a loved one. I urge the committee to include language in the DHS appropriations to ensure that no federal funds are used to implement this cruel rule. Congress must send a clear message that we did not authorize this policy change in our immigration laws. This administration has also imposed travel bans that discriminate against certain people based on religion and national origin. Even though the first two bans were found unconstitutional, the Supreme Court upheld the third iteration of the ban that excludes people from predominantly Muslim-majority countries in Trump versus Hawaii. This has given the president latitude to expand the ban, as he did last month when he added 6 more countries with significant Muslim populations to the travel ban. That is why, in addition to introducing 2214, the No Ban Act, which would limit the president's authority to implement these broad bans, I introduced H.R. 810 to ensure that no federal funds would be used to implement the ban. The Muslim ban continues to tear families apart and cause misery and psychological trauma. Spouses and fiancés are separated. Weddings, funerals, and graduations have all been missed. Over 5,000 adopted children of U.S. citizens cannot use this, cannot join their families. So I urge the committee to include language ensuring that federal funds are not used to implement any iterations of the travel ban. Lastly, I request that this committee include language to help relieve the family and employment immigration visa backlog. There are currently over 4 million people in the family immigration backlog waiting to reunite with their loved ones in the U.S. The average wait time for a permanent resident to sponsor an unmarried son or daughter from Mexico is over 20 years. My bill, the Reuniting Families Act, takes steps to address our current immigration visa backlogs by modernizing our family immigration system and provide relief to families who've been separated for years. Specifically, the bill captures unused visas lost over the past 2 decades, ends the practice of counting spouses and children against the visa caps, and allows judicial discretion in granting visas. I request that these provisions of my bill be included in the fiscal year 2021 Department of Homeland Security Appropriations bill so that families can finally be reunited and more visas can be allocated for immigrants who've already met the criteria to come to the United States. Well, thank you for allowing me to testify, and I look forward to working with the committee on these important immigration priorities.
Thank you, Ms. Xu, for sharing your testimony with us. Members, any questions?
No questions, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Mr. Hill is
Mr. Hill. French Hill, I assume. Mr. Hill, thank you so much for being here with the subcommittee, and you may proceed with your testimony.
Well, Mr. Chairman, thank you for letting members come before the subcommittee and testify. I appreciate our Appropriations Committee being so welcoming to non-Appropriations Committee members. Today, I'd like to testify in front of you about the funding for Assistance to Firefighter Grant Program and the Staffing for Adequate Fire and Emergency Response Program, the AFG and SAFER Act grants. Fire departments need adequate staffing, equipment, and training to keep our communities safe, and these programs have a significant impact on fire departments in my home state of Arkansas. While I've been in office since 2015, fire departments in my district have received more than $7.5 million through these 2 grant programs. 17 individual fire departments have received 30 grant awards. The highest award was $2.6 million, a SAFER grant to North Little Rock, Arkansas, and the smallest award was an $8,000 AFG grant to the Shaw Fire Department. This shows that even the smallest award changes the lives of those living in that community. With a small grant of $19,000, an award received by the Burnt Ridge Fire Department, they were able to purchase thermal cameras, which is a game changer when responding to a very serious call. Burnt Ridge is a small town with less than 300 people and was also able to purchase a new brush truck, which allowed the fire department to go off-road and fight forest fires. Before they received that grant funding, they were using a converted 1965 military truck. In Arkansas' 2nd Congressional District, our departments need a new self-contained breathing apparatus desperately, especially in our smaller departments where they are old and outdated and no longer certifiable under operational standards. Our departments also need turnout cabinets. Firefighters are putting their lives on the line, not just in the immediate risk of bodily harm, but in the increased risk of harmful contaminants. Compliant washer extractors cost over $12,000 per unit, and forced ambient air gear dryers needed to extend the life of this gear cost over $10,000 per unit. This is well over the budget for most of the departments in my district. They need these units to clean their turnout gear after runs in order to remove the harmful contaminants. In Central Arkansas, we have a strong community spirit, and the firefighters know that if one department is able to purchase one of these turnout cabinets, then the area departments, especially volunteers, will be able to keep their turnout gear safe and well maintained. Assistance to firefighter and the SAFER grant funding is necessary for fire departments in my district. The needs are far too great for them to do it alone, and we're proud to support them in their applications. These grants have changed communities, and it makes the area exponentially and unmeasurably safer. Looking at the split between those grants in Arkansas' 2nd District since 2015, under the firefighter grant program, $3.6 million, and under the Safer grant program, $3.9 million. And when you look at all the departments and all the way they've used it, they've spread these dollars so well across so many needs, matched with local taxpayer dollars. And you know, when you live in a state that's a real mix, just like the states you represent, of rural and urban areas, these volunteer fire departments just don't have the funding necessary to do it on their own. And by having a well-funded, well-equipped fire department, you've got lower insurance rates, and that makes for a better and safer community. So I thank my friends on the Appropriations Committee for letting me testify today. Yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Hill. And we certainly agree with you. The Safer grants and those type of programs work extremely well in so many parts of the country. So we certainly join you to see if we can add more money to that.
Thank you, and appreciate your service.
Any questions, members?
Thank you,
Mr.
Mr. Hill.
Fletchman?
Thank you, sir.
Mr. Hill, thank you.
We have 4 more members that are due to arrive in about 2 or 3 minutes.
Ms. Jackson Lee, it's a pleasure seeing you again. And again, you may proceed with your testimony. Thank you for sharing your thoughts with the Subcommittee on Homeland Appropriations.
Well, more importantly, thank you for the opportunity to do so. I'm going to go a little bit, and Vice Chair Cuellar, thank you so very much. We've worked together on many issues, and delighted to see you here and in your position, being a fellow Texan. I'm trying to think, but as I've come before this committee on many occasions, because I happen to live in Houston, and in my congressional tenure, I experienced Hurricane Katrina, which caused us to take almost 250,000 people in Texas from Louisiana. Rita compounded Hurricane Katrina. We didn't get the direct hit on Hurricane Katrina, but we did have Rita that came subsequently thereafter. Hurricane Ike, I'm reminded that my district was without power for 6 weeks, and that impacted not only families, but as well it impacted businesses. Then in between, there was something called Tax Day flood, May Day flood, and each of those occasions, because we are the Bayou City, infrastructure did not work. And finally, 51 trillion gallons of water fell on Houston and also the surrounding areas after Hurricane Harvey, one of the most significant natural disasters in the United States. What we determined is that pre-preparation is crucial. Citizen training is crucial. And various tools that have been provided by Homeland Security and the funding over the years is crucial as well. So I am trying to rewrite the FEMA bill in terms of how it responds to disasters, but I want to support $20 billion for pre-disaster mitigation program within FEMA, which takes a forward-looking approach to prepare for a disaster before it occurs. There's something called CERT teams as well, that are volunteer teams that I'd like to see expanded. Mitigation under the pre-disaster mitigation program enables communities to recover more quickly when a disaster strikes and ultimately saves money associated with costly disaster recovery. In fact, it is estimated that each $1 spent on mitigation saves roughly $3 to $4 on disaster spending. I want to support $8.5 billion for TSA to fully address additional requirements and screening processes and procedures. I'd like the Appropriations Committee to be supportive of regularizing the TSA work personnel to help and assist in retention. They are not on the same civil service grading as the other DEA, ATF, and other police services. It causes us to lose people at management level. They may not leave the federal government, but they leave TSA. I am a enthusiastic user of the Transportation Security Administration services, as all of us do as we travel through airports, but it's really not highlighted how they save lives. If you were to look at their inventory, the guns and knives that they have, the various ridiculous items that people may be trying to get on board. So I support it, but I want to support dollars going into professionalism, and I want to support dollars going into restructuring their personnel system to allow them to be part of the civil service system, and that will take some additional funding. I support $60 million for university programs and Homeland Security Centers of Excellence. I initiated the first transportation security, forgive my voice, security center of excellence at Texas Southern University, among other campuses, to train about issues of transportation security. They are particularly vital in historically black colleges because they begin to open up career opportunities, but also train in neighborhoods how they work and relate to Homeland Security needs. I support robust funding for FEMA's hazard mitigation. Those grants reduce disaster losses, protect life and property from future disasters. Mitigation include community risk reduction, improve resilience of critical infrastructure, risk reduction for vulnerabilities from natural hazards, and climate change. I support $435 million for the staffing for adequate fire and emergency response. That's a SAFER grant program. Some communities just had a major fire in my district where about 30 families were displaced. Particularly in poor communities, fires impact them more drastically. I support $765 million for urban USS grants, and I don't mind them being fairly distributed, but those of us who are large communities really depend on those USS grants. I support $125 million for transit security grant programs. I won't go into it. I support $60 million for urban area security initiative, nonprofit security grant programs. I support $60 million for the National Urban Search and Rescue Response System that has assisted in the Oklahoma City bombing, increased federal funding in that area of National Urban Search and Rescue, relieves a burden on cash-strapped local governments, and provides training. Finally, I support $25 million for immigrant integration citizenship programs within the U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services. Let me also acknowledge the chairperson of this committee, but let me just finish and close on this issue. I had two press conferences. One immediately after the briefing that we had. This is a bipartisan issue. This is a nonpartisan issue. I distinctly remember the presentation made by our health professionals, our CDC, our NIH, our Secretary of Homeland Security, and HHS, who told us specifically that we had nothing to worry about the coronavirus, that it was not going to get here to the United States. In that meeting, I asked, nonpartisan, bipartisan, asked as a member trying to just get information, is there a team? Is there a task force? And of course, what was said is, well, you know, we're sitting here, we're a task force. I know what task force are. Those are the people who are in the weeds with the door closed, calling this scientist and that scientist and this doctor and that doctor. They're not the broad base of leadership. They had no answer. As I left Houston, I did a press conference and pulled materials off of CDC, just the simple materials that said, this is what you do if you have flu-like symptoms, to put them in your restaurants. No one has any information, and yes, we are now in the midst of a potential pandemic. Homeland Security, HHS, and a number of other agencies, you are appropriators, you're being asked for the $2.5 billion. There's no task force. The American people are frightened. They are frightened Restaurant people came up to me and said, what do we do? No one is telling us anything. We need a basic announcement or information pool now. We have printed materials. Okay, 2.5 billion is getting ready for treatment. And I also ask that every airport, small or large, have some way. They're not going to have, everyone is not going to have the contamination facilities or the facilities to be able to detain people appropriately. But every community should have at least a response if something happens in the mode of transportation. Buses, trains, airplanes. I think we're it, and I think we need to work in a bipartisan manner. I'm concerned. No hospital personnel in the county hospitals. You ask your county leadership if they'll tell you the truth. Does Nurse Jones know what to do? And I'll close as I watch you looking at my time. We experienced Ebola in Texas, and it was in the Dallas hospital. It was a Nigerian native individual, Nigerian American. Only it was too late when they determined that it was Ebola because they treated him without any protection. But they determined that it was Ebola. And that's when the aftermath of that's when the containment came, the isolation came. But the health professionals had left town. Somebody went to go get married, somebody else went on vacation. They had already left. So I just want to, you're a very important committee, and this is a very important appropriators. Homeland Security, Mr. Cuellar, to me, connotes protecting the homeland. We are in some serious concerns right now, and I think we need to come together in a bipartisan manner. I think the Congress needs to speak, and we need to be directed in our message to what should be done.
Thank you, Ms. Jackson. Yeah, and we thank you for the work that you do in Homeland. You've been one of the chairwomen for many years, so we appreciate your work. Members, any questions?
Mr. Chairman, I'd just like to make a comment. I would like to thank Ms. Lee for her thoughtful presentation, and I agree, this is a crisis. I had the privilege yesterday of actually being in Nebraska on some other congressional business, but I was briefed on the status, and they are taking some patients there and quarantining them there. And this is something I think you perhaps saw today, that the minority leader put a figure of about $4 billion out there. But I do agree with you. We have got to stress, get all the politics out of this. The American people, as you aptly put it, are very concerned about this. It's affecting international markets and the like. So again, I thank you for your thoughtful approach and advocacy.
Thank you. Well, I'm here to collaborate with you. Thank you. And thank you for the word that was quarantine. I don't want them detained, but quarantine. Thank you so very much. Thank you. Thank you.
Chairman,
Chairman, it's terrific to be here. Mr. Fleischman, good to see you, my colleague. I do appreciate the opportunity to testify before the subcommittee, and I'm testifying today to discuss my concerns regarding the current administration's security vetting procedures, which may be exacerbating a historic low of refugee admissions. At a time when we have over 70 million forcefully displaced persons, I don't think processes should prevent us from our humanitarian obligation. I would emphasize that refugees are more thoroughly vetted than any other group coming into the United States. I would continue to advocate for effective measures to protect our national security. In October of 2017, the administration imposed new data collection requirements for all refugees and heightened security vetting regulations for refugees from 11 countries and several other Muslim-majority countries. The implementation of these procedures has affected tens of thousands of refugees without appreciable benefit. It has also created significant backlogs in refugee applications and extended processing times indefinitely. In the case of Syria, for example, refugee admissions went from 12,587 in 2016 fiscal year to 65 in fiscal year 2018. My concern is due to the lack of transparency, the full impact of additional security vetting requirements on both overall refugee admissions and refugee admissions from Muslim-majority countries is unclear. That is why I strongly encourage the subcommittee to consider additional reporting requirements through the 21 appropriations process in order to obtain a better understanding of the delays and increased denials. My understanding is our staff and office is working with the committee staff. They have been terrific and we'll look forward to continuing in that regard. And again, would thank you for this opportunity.
Members, any questions?
I'd just like to thank the chairman.
Thank you very much. See you at Energy and Commerce.
Yes, sir.
See you tomorrow.
Thank you so much for your testimony.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. Barry, thank you.
So efficient.
Yeah, your name is. Barry, thank you so much for being here, sharing your thoughts and your statement with the subcommittee. Thank you so much for being here to you, and we ask you to proceed at this time.
All right, well, I sure appreciate you. Great to see you, Chairman Cuellar at this point, and Ranking Member Fleischman. You're great Americans and great friends, and I really mean, I do appreciate it. I appreciate the opportunity to present my views and priorities for the FY21 Homeland Security Appropriations Bill. Over the past few Congresses, this particular bill has been the subject of significant partisan controversy, as you know, undermining the efforts of the Department to meet its important responsibilities. The Department's mission is vital to the health, safety, and well-being of every American citizen. It's incumbent upon us to ensure that the DHS has the resources necessary to carry out its missions. To that end, I urge you to appropriate the amounts requested by the administration to secure our borders and enforce our immigration laws. Before this administration, these funds regularly were provided without controversy or conflict because they are desperately needed. The situation at our border reached crisis levels in FY19 when a total of 851,508 individuals were apprehended between ports of entry on our southwest border, due largely to a lack of physical barriers and a lack of Border Patrol manpower. Until these issues are addressed, our borders will remain unsecure, posing a threat to our national security. While securing our border is necessary to secure our nation, it's by no means sufficient. Security requires enforcement of our immigration laws in the interior of the United States, far beyond what we currently have. Despite this administration's increased enforcement efforts, far too many aliens who have been ordered removed remain in the country. The root cause of this issue is inadequate funding for ICE detention beds, which restricts the ability to detain removable aliens. At the end of FY19, there were 595,430 fugitive aliens in the U.S. These guys were walking around even though they were ordered removed, but either not placed in custody or they were just simply released. It's incomprehensible to law-abiding citizens that over 500,000 aliens ordered removed remain in our nation. This situation can be addressed only by providing ICE with the resources it needs. Another issue plaguing our immigration system is the lack of immigration judges to adjudicate the ever-expanding backlog of immigration cases. The non-detained docket stands at 3.2 million cases, and the average caseload per judge exceeds 2,200. While I understand funding for immigration judges falls under the CGS Appropriations Bill, we must ensure the simultaneous growth of ICE legal staff. Finally, I request the subcommittee include $50 million in continued funding for the reimbursement of airports that took early action to install inline baggage screening systems in response to the 9/11 terrorist attacks. 14 airports, including Harrisburg International Airport in the district I'm proud to represent, installed the systems with the expectation and the promise of timely reimbursement. Almost 20 years since the attacks, these airports are still owed approximately $87 million. Addressing these outstanding debts will greatly assist these critical security partners. Thank you for your consideration, and I look forward to answering any of your questions.
Mr. Perry, thank you so much for your testimony and for your statement. Members, Mr. Fleischman?
Mr. Perry, thank you. I want to thank you for your testimony, your advocacy. I've got no questions. Thank you, sir.
I have an airport looking for that money too. Good job.
When we make promises, then we need to honor those promises, right? Or it diminishes our credibility. We really appreciate your service and the opportunity. Thank you.
Mr. Perry, thank you so much for appearing with us. Gentleman from California, Mr. Lou Correa, is asked to make his presentation.
Gentleman from Texas, Mr. Cuellar, thank you very much. Thank the Chairwoman Allard and Ranking Member Mr. Fleischman.
Thank you, sir.
The distinguished members of this community, subcommittee I should say, for the opportunity to testify about national security items that I believe the Subcommittee of Homeland Security Appropriations should address in fiscal year 2021 Appropriations Bill. As Chairman of the Transportation Maritime Security Subcommittee of Homeland Security, I've led multiple hearings to discuss our Homeland Security priorities and interest in the Arctic. I've expressed concerns about the aggressive actions of nations such as Russia, who've increased their footprints within the Arctic in recent years. Currently, Russia has a large icebreaker fleet that consists of over 50 icebreakers. In comparison, we, the U.S., the Coast Guard, currently operates only 2 aging polar icebreakers, a heavy one commissioned in 1976 and a medium one commissioned in the year 2000. The Coast Guard's ability and the Coast Guard's limited number of icebreakers impacts its ability to carry out its mission in the Arctic. According to Admiral Charles Ray, the Coast Guard Vice Commandant, who testified at the Transportation and Maritime Security Subcommittee hearing earlier this month, our ability to patrol the Arctic depends on the President's presence of icebreakers in this region. The Coast Guard has said that it will need 6 polar security cutters to carry out this mission in the next few years. Accordingly, we need to continue these investments and provide increased funding for the Coast Guard's procurement, construction, and improvement account for the construction of new and modern icebreakers. And if I may, next I'd like to turn to an issue of importance to my district and around the country, and that's a national network of fusion centers that serve a vital role in the information sharing of criminal and terrorist threats to our country. The national network consists of 79 state-owned and operated centers, including our own Orange County Intelligence Assessment Center. Established in 2007, this center is nationally recognized as having been named the National Fusion Center in 2018. And it's led by our Orange County Sheriff and his department, and it consists of municipal agencies, fire agencies, federal, and law enforcement agencies. And each year, these fusion centers take over 1,000 tips that lead to potential threats, which have successfully addressed many threats posed by domestic hate groups, transnational organized crime, and cybercrime. And the funding of these centers is, of course, critical, as local agencies rely on urban area security initiative funding and state homeland security grant programs to fund these efforts. I'm concerned that the President's proposed budget would cut these programs. This is a concern, and I hope that Congress has the wisdom to restore the funding of these fusion centers across the country. And with that, I want to thank all of you for your time and interest today.
Thank you so much for your testimony, for being here with the subcommittee. Mr. Fletchman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Correa, thank you for addressing the urgency in the Arctic. I traveled with our great United States Coast Guard up there, and this is a region where our adversaries are very active. They are very well financed, as you alluded to, in terms of the amount of icebreakers vis-a-vis ours. It looks like we have 2 more icebreakers funded in this budget. I think that's going to be critically important, but it is an area of the world where we have got to be very cognizant of what our adversaries are doing. So thank you for raising that, sir.
Thank you, and I would just like to add, Mr. Fleischman, that China has 2 nuclear-powered cutters that are coming online in the next few months.
Yes, sir, and you're absolutely right. And ours, although they are conventional, they will be good. We were on the Healy, which is an older one, but you're absolutely right. They are really investing very heavily in this technology, and it's something that we need to be aware of.
In many ways, this is really patrolling and taking care of our northern border between Alaska and Russia.
Yes, sir. Thank you.
Thank you very much, gentlemen.
Thank you for your testimony. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
At this time, having no other members present, we will adjourn this subcommittee meeting.